For more, let's bring in the chairman of the House Oversight Committee who led today's hearing, Congressman James Comer. Congressman, the bigger picture is Tony Fauci is an example of why anyone in a position of that much power, unregulated power, should not be in that position for nearly 4 decades. Going forward, how does Congress prevent someone from big-footing, or in his case, little-footing? Say, Robert Redfield at the CDC, who is truly supposed to be in charge of the pandemic response. How do you prevent this from happening again?
Well, I think today was a perfect example of why we need term limits, not just for Congress, but for bureaucrats. Dr. Fauci's done more harm than any human being that I can think of in my lifetime to public education and to our economy, what he did to run up the deficit. He won't take responsibility for anything. And what today's hearing was about was not only to get the truth to the American people that he was wrong on so many of the damaging policies he had, but to try to begin some type of accountability. What Congress needs to do is to ensure that no one person ever has that much power again in the face of a public health crisis. Instead of one Dr. Fauci, we need 3 Dr. Faucis, and they need to cite their science. They need to cite their evidence and give the American people transparency when they make suggestions about public health.
Congressman, Fauci was the face. You know, all of these things that we had to do, he was the guy always carrying the message. But when he was asked about that plainly today, what he kept saying was, well, you know, that wasn't my decision. That was the CDC. I see a lot of buck passing in D.C., but not to that degree. But that tells me that we're not going to get any accountability here. There's no mea culpa. It's just not my problem. You can all go away, Congressman. What do you do about that?
Well, you know, time will tell whether or not he was truthful. We've had emails that showed that there was an ongoing effort around Dr. Fauci to delete emails, to hide freedom of information requests, to not be transparent. He said today when I asked him about it, he didn't know anything about it, and he threw all of his employees under the bus. He threw his advisor under the bus. He threw his chief of staff under the bus. He threw the CDC under the bus. He threw everyone under the bus, but yet he failed to take responsibility for any of the mistakes. We didn't hear any apologies from Anthony Fauci. All we heard in the apology category were the Democrats apologizing to Dr. Fauci for Republicans asking him tough questions.
Congressman, the entire pandemic response, based on what the American people saw, were based on Tony Fauci's narrow abilities as an epidemiologist. He's not a psychologist, he's not an expert in childhood education and development, and he's certainly not an economist. And Dr. David Asher was on America Reports today, led the State Department's report into the origins of COVID, and he asked the question, the biggest mystery, and I can't figure out why Congress isn't looking into it, is how did Tony Fauci step into a void and take charge and take over what was the responsibility of Robert Redfield at the CDC? That he had no statutory duty to do what he did. So what are you going to look into or do to get to the bottom of how did he wind up with the power that he did? And even secondarily, Robert Redfield, it was Kadick at HHS who was secondarily in charge of the pandemic response.
Yeah, there were so many failures in the administration, quite frankly, at that time. There were failures by the media. The media put Dr. Fauci on a pedestal. The media made him the leading star and the most famous person of the hour for several months. And I think that cannot be repeated. But at the end of the day, there has to be checks and balances within the NIH, within the CDC. We need to get out of the WHO. That's something that Republicans have been fighting for. We've not gotten any support in the Senate. So there are a lot of reform efforts, and hopefully we'll be able to take steps to see that history does not repeat itself if there's ever another pandemic.
He also put the United States on the road to ruin because of the deficit, and he's not going to.
That's right.
Nothing to pay there for him either. Thank you, Congressman James Comer. Always a pleasure, sir.
Thank you.